So the harm principle has a view that an individual's own good, either physical or moral, is not sufficient warrant for interference. If I like to smoke cigarettes and it harms me, it's my own choice. The state cannot come and say, you cannot smoke cigarettes. If I like to do dangerous sports like mountain climbing, 我喜欢去爬山，没问题，是我的选择，对不对？ The state cannot stop people from doing things in their own good. Okay? Whether it's physical or moral. In Mill's view, which is also a standard view among liberals now, if I should be free to choose my own way of life and to make mistakes, so long as I don't harm other people, the state cannot interfere. If I choose to, when I walk here and then I like to jump up here, maybe a little bit dangerous, it's my choice. The police cannot come and stop me from doing that. But there are two exceptions. The first one is not so controversial. Children are not sufficiently rational to freely choose their own way of life, right? We can't ask a 5-year-old to plan his or her life and then we just withdraw and let that 5-year-old plan his or her own way of life, right? A 5-year-old might like to play with a cute dog and say, this is my conception of the good life. I want to do this all my life. Well, if I'm a parent, I can say, no, you can't. I can force you to go to school. 可以强迫你, force you to go to school, force you to go to bed early, force you to eat healthy food, because eventually the child needs to grow into an adult and reach the point where he or she can freely choose to live his or her own way of life according to his or her conception of the good life. That's relatively uncontroversial, whether it's the West or whether it's China or most societies around the world. The second exception, though, is hugely controversial and, to be frank, very distasteful. I think most of us would probably agree. 很难接受. He says barbarians, 野蛮人, they can be forced to do things because they are not sufficiently rational. And who are these 野蛮人? Who are these barbarians? Well, in his view, to be a little bit blunt, it was non-Western civilizations like India and like China. And here we have to keep in mind that Mill was also not just a philosopher, not just a politician, but he was also, let's put it this way, a businessman. He had a very important post with the East India Company, which basically governed India as a colony in the 19th century and was responsible for or at least partly responsible for the opium trade that led to the Opium War with China. So when we hear this today, it's very ugly, very disturbing, 很难接受. But who else was writing around the same time and had perhaps a more, well, let's say, realistic view of how people's economic interests sometimes influence their ideas? Of course, Karl Marx, right? Around the same time, Karl Marx was writing his great works, including Capital. 资本论. And of course, for Karl Marx, he would have looked at John Stuart Mill and criticized him for his views about non-Western peoples as being biased by his economic interests. Although, well, we can argue whether Karl Marx himself had strange views on this topic, but let's leave that aside for the moment. So, what are the three main arguments for the harm principle? Or put it this way, what are the three good consequences that come from a society and a government that acts according to the harm principle and that promotes policies in accordance with the standard of the harm principle? He gives three reasons. The first is perhaps the most famous, and it's quite similar to the passage that we looked at from the 论语, from the Analects of Confucius. Freedom of inquiry, or today we just say freedom of speech, is important means to truth. Freedom of inquiry just means 言论自由. If you don't have 言论自由, if you don't have this freedom of inquiry to pursue our ideas of the truth so long as we don't physically harm people, then this is the only way to have more truth in society. His second reason is that freedom of inquiry is necessary for self-determination, 自我决定. Remember, his view about happiness, the higher form of happiness. You can only be truly happy if you choose your own way of life. And the third reason is that he argued that freedom is important for social progress. Okay, we're going to look at each of those arguments in certain amount of detail. And I want you to help me by giving some examples. And at the end of this lecture, I will ask you to critically reflect upon what he says, tell me whether you agree or disagree, and give reasons for your views, okay? This is a class in political philosophy. You can't just say, 我觉得, whatever. You have to give reasons for your views, okay? Let's look at the first argument. Why is freedom of inquiry, 言论自由, why is it a means for the truth? Why? 为什么是可以说是真理的手段? Well, he gives several reasons. And the first is perhaps the most obvious. If an opinion is silenced, you may be losing the truth. If I'm not allowed to express my views, then you might be losing part, or maybe even the whole of the truth. Give me an example of this in human history, whether in China or the West or elsewhere. 有没有一些例子？不允许说话，所以我们会有不好的结果，尤其是追求真理方面。
秦朝时候焚书坑儒，压制包括儒家还有道家之类的其他思想家的思想，然后在一定程度上，比如关于理智、关于道德的观点就被压制了。还有在西方中世纪的时候，对于自然科学的一些压制，导致了诸如对于日心说啊这样的观点的压制，也是我们错失了在当时错失了部分的真理，在后来被我们证明是起码在一定程度上是可以运用的。
OK， 关于第一部分你都补充一些。
第一部分指的，比如，主要是两阶段，一个阶段是秦朝时期焚书坑儒，焚书坑儒指一方面就是对于中国传统的除了法家以及秦国本身采用的理论之外的所有其他的学说进行压制。这样的压制，在以儒家为例，他就压制了儒家中，比如关于人与人之间那种家庭关系的重要性的那种在社会学说上的重要性的那种真理的意义。然后另一个说法就是在之后从汉代开始的尊儒重法的传统，尊重儒家，尊崇法家，以至于到后期发展到理学对于自由意见的一种压制，使我们对于自由的追求尤其在明清成为一种被压制的观点，而我们现在可以认为追求自由是在一定程度上起码是还有真理性的。
OK， 这些例子都挺好，对不对？第一个是非常清楚。The first emperor of China, right, 秦始皇帝, we know that he buried Confucian scholars alive with their books. Obviously, now we wish he hadn't done that because we would like to see what's in those books. And maybe there's something important and interesting to tell us about the good life, right? In the West, there's even more, there's some examples that are perhaps even more clear if they come from natural science, right? The astronomist Galileo challenged the conventional view in that the sun revolves around the earth. He used science to show that actually the earth revolves around the sun. But the Catholic Church at the time was very upset and silenced him and said, you cannot express that view. And he was not allowed to express that view. Luckily, eventually, he could, or at least that view could be expressed, but due to silencing views that may be correct, that have a lot of truth, we lose much of value. So Mill argues that if you look at the societies that produce a lot of innovations, basically they have a commitment to the truth and to the pursuit of truth. And in order for people to pursue their ideas of truth or of the good life, you need to have freedom to do so. Okay? But he gives other reasons that are a bit more nuanced and maybe less obvious. He says, even if an opinion is wrong, or at least mainly wrong, 我们应该说不完全是错的，但是大部分是错的。It may still contain a portion of the truth, and you should not silence it. What's an example of that? 有没有一些例子可以想象？好，谢谢。
刚才可能也部分提到了，就是比如伽利略、哥白尼等人提倡的日心说。我们现在知道，宇宙的中心，我们不说宇宙有没有边际，但起码宇宙中心应该不是太阳。但是日心说起码证明了在太阳系内，太阳是中心，而地球不是中心这样一个真理的事实。
OK， 但是为什么是错的吗？
因为日心说的整体的观念，它不是说太阳系中太阳是中心，而是认为整个宇宙这个范围内太阳是中心。而我们现在知道，太阳并不是宇宙的中心，它仅仅是在太阳系中是中心而已。就是说由于界定范围的错误，导致它的整体意见是错误的，但是其中它关于太阳系的看法起码是正确的。
Okay, so I think that's an interesting example. I mean, another example, let's take another example maybe from China. As you probably know, after the first dynasty of China, there was hardly any defense of 法家, right? 一直到20世纪的时候 没有中国知识分子都说 我觉得法家有一些好处。Maybe it's true that 法家很多方面是错的，大部分是错的。But maybe it's not completely wrong, right? Maybe sometimes if there's a lot of chaos in society, you do need to have strong uses of punishment and fear to control people, at least possible. And if you silence 法家, you're losing a portion of the truth. Maybe throughout much, it hurts me to say this because I like Confucianism, but maybe 法家 also has part of the truth, even if it's mainly wrong. And therefore, we should allow people who defend 法家 to express their views. Today in China, not many people openly express commitment to 法家, but maybe they should. Let's look at another example. Now this is interesting because, the example comes from the Catholic Church. Even if the received opinion is the whole truth, we need a devil's advocate to understand its rational grounds. 这什么意思？魔鬼代言人，你们有人知道吗？那你再说。
是中世纪的时候，基督教就是他在封圣徒的时候，需要有一些人来扮演魔鬼代言人这样一个角色，去吹毛求疵，寻找这个人身上尽可能的，就是不符合基督教对于圣徒的认识的言行的观点，来确保这个人的生前的言行是完全符合圣徒要求的，这样一个角色就叫做魔鬼代言人。
对，挺好，非常好。So in the Catholic Church, there was an assumption that if I say, for example, God is good, I need to defend my views. How do I understand the reasons for my views? By arguing with somebody who represents the opposite view. The devil would argue with me. And if I could respond to the devil and come up with reasons for my views, then this gives a stronger basis for my views. So the devil should be allowed to express his views, even in a Catholic Church, even if the view is totally wrong, so that those who defend the correct view understand their reasons for that view. I can give you another example. This happens to me. When I'm from Canada, and when I go back to Canada, and then I argue sometimes with family members or with friends who think that everything in China is bad because they read the media and they have a very, let's say, negative view of China. And they think China is a kind of totalitarian society where the state is always watching us. Every aspect of our life is controlled. We have no freedom. All human rights are violated. I mean, I think we know it's a wrong view, but I need to be able to respond to that view, right? Once I can respond to that view and give reasons for my view, which is that, of course, China in many ways, of course, has problems, but it's also perhaps one of the most freest times in all of Chinese history, right? We have the freedom. The women and men can come to classes. People can travel abroad. People can marry as they see fit. They can choose their own work. In many ways, it's one of the most freest times of Chinese history. Of course, there are problems, but I think that's the correct view. But I have to argue against, for example, sometimes even my sister in Canada who holds a different view, in order to have good sense of the reasons for my own view, which may be the correct view in this case. Another reason for why it's important to have freedom of speech in order to lead to truth. Well, truth is not just an abstract thing. It has to have an effect on the way that we lead our lives, right? And here, John Stuart Mill was critical. He wasn't so much an atheist,他不是无神论者. He was more like an agnostic, 不可知论的. But he was very critical of the ordinary beliefs of Christians in his own day, because they would say beautiful things like, I should love my neighbor. But when you look at the way that they lead their lives, often it was not consistent with the ideas that they espouse. In other words, their values had no effect on their behavior, on their conduct. So, we need to have freedom to articulate our views so that eventually it has an effect on behavior. If I say, for example, I should love my neighbor, then somebody should argue with me, why do you need to love your neighbor? Then that person should have the freedom to argue. I should have the freedom to respond. Once I have reasons to think of why I should love my neighbor, then it will influence the way that I lead my life. Or in Buddhism, there is this idea of compassion. It's a beautiful idea. Does it influence people's behavior? You have primarily Buddhist countries like Sri Lanka, for example, and Myanmar, where sometimes Buddhists seem to do violent things. It seems inconsistent with their beliefs. Maybe it's a case where the mainstream view is just 它就是偏见，不会影响他们的生活方式。Or if we think that some Confucian values are beautiful, right? 和谐，比如说, but the way that I deal with people is not harmonious, then obviously I have a received opinion but has no effect on conduct. So, people should criticize me if I'm not leading a life in accordance with my values. Only then might it have an effect on the way that I lead my life.